Well, good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. We continue our journey with a prophet in Babylon, Chapter 10, Part B, Margaret's Dissimulation. Mrs. Small was also of the opinion that there are a great many things which ought not to be mentioned in the pulpit at all, and these prohibited themes happened to include about 9/10 of the subject matter of the Bible. It was a little difficult to know on what subjects a minister might preach at all for her edification. It sounds a little incredible, but it is nevertheless true, as many people will remember, that when Gaunt introduced the recital of the Ten Commandments with responses on the first Sunday of the month, Mrs. Small expressed her opinion that the Decalogue was coarse, that it was offensive to her fine female sense to hear murder and theft and adultery mentioned with such brutal frankness. For a while that kind of thing might be all right for depraved Jews in the time of Moses, but it was totally unnecessary in New York, where of course such things never happened. She was even more angry when Gaunt preached one morning on the woman who was a sinner. For that particular morning she had with her, in her pew, an engaged couple of quite mature years. They were each close to 40, to whom such a theme must have been most awkward, and a provocation of disagreeable blushes. "We don't come to church to hear about such things," she said angrily to Margaret. "The Sunday papers are bad enough." "Do you find them so?" retorted Margaret, which was again an unwise speech, for Mrs. Small was a great reader of the Sunday papers, a fact of which Margaret was perfectly aware. Then Mrs. Small assumed an almost proprietary interest in Margaret's house, which she often visited, not from any love for Margaret, but for the opportunity for criticism which the house afforded. She would pretend to admire its taste and have an artistic interest in its furniture, after which she would remark with an air of patient meekness, "Well, I don't see how you can afford all these nice things anyway. I know we can't have them. My husband won't have anything that isn't quite simple." The implication, of course, was that Margaret was extravagant, whereas she was simply one of those wise modern women who have discovered that ugliness is no cheaper than beauty. And the Smalls were people who didn't know the one from the other, but chose the ugly things from a natural love of ugliness. Margaret made the most praiseworthy efforts to live at peace with persons of this description, but the trouble was that they were so arrogant in their inferiority that they would not let her. They could not help wishing to humble her, because in their hearts they were jealous of her. When Gaunt began to think and act for himself in the ways that we have seen, Mrs. Small and her tribe became really venomous with their indignation. They lost no opportunity of veiled or open insult, all of which Margaret endured in silence so far as her husband was concerned. That baffled maternal instinct, whose shrine was the room with the closed door where her child had died, now flowered anew in defense of her husband. It became the first duty of her life to shield him from petty irritations while he made his way toward new heights of thought. And but for her enfolding combative maternity, perhaps he would never have reached those heights at all. But he never knew the cost to her. No trace of agitation marred the calm beauty of her face. For him her lips had only smiles and sweet encouragement, which was another triumph of dissimulation. What grieved her most in those weeks of crisis, however, was the manifest failure of friendship among those whom she had trusted. It seemed as though she leaned on no one who was not a broken reed that pierced the hand which leant upon it. There were the Taskers, for example, people whom she genuinely liked, and to whom she had shown much kindness, especially to the wife, who thought herself delicate, and was always in need of service. They, like herself, were childless, and lived a somewhat lonely life. For this reason she had been drawn toward them, had invited them often to her house, especially on Sunday evenings, and special occasions like Thanksgiving Day and Christmas. But from the hour when the trouble had begun in the church, they stood aloof. They nearly always found some excuse to avoid visiting the house. On the one of two occasions when they came, they were painfully embarrassed and restrained. If Margaret had not had a wholesome sense of the ridiculous, she would have been much more hurt than she was, for it was a truly absurd sight to see the little man trying to avoid the burning question, yet always coming back to it like a moth to a flame. beginning explanations which ended in nothing, speaking with an unusual assumption of authority on subjects of which he knew nothing, and always falling back on his favorite phrase that things act and react. She humorlessly christened him Act and React, and called him by that name when she discussed affairs with Palmer, which she often did. But at the back of her mind there was a sense of hurt, a pang of bitter disappointment. If these people, to whom she had given so much real affection, were only fair-weather friends, whom could she trust? If at the first strain their friendship broke down, where was a truly loyal friendship to be found? She did not see then what she recognized long afterwards, that church friendships are of an order by themselves. They are, after all, but official friendships. The friends who come to you thus are imposed upon you by accidental relationship. They are not deliberately chosen by that process of affinity which constitutes any real friendship. Besides, with people as fluid as Tasker, no real friendship is ever possible. No amount of kindness can overcome radical feebleness of character, or turn it into steadfastness and constancy. It is a lesson not easy to learn, and Margaret found it no easier than other people do. She shed a good many secret tears over it. For a time she felt as though there was no such thing as disinterested loyalty in life. Then her better sense prevailed. She remembered Palmer and Gordon. She began to recognize that disillusion is not the only lesson in life. Life has its revelations too, but disillusions must precede them. As we journey toward the higher things, the company improves, and if we have fewer friends, we have in them the true comrades of the spirit, whose alliance with us is beyond the shock of circumstances. There was also another compensation which Margaret had never recollected without a thrill of gratitude. As those in whom she had trusted gradually withdrew, another class of people came nearer. People like Mrs. Holcomb, whose worth she had never recognized. Her friendships had been among the richer members of the church, not from choice, still less from any kind of social snobbery, but simply because these friendships had been imposed upon her by the situation. The new note of militant democracy which Gaunt had struck naturally offended these people, and they were quick to declare their displeasure. They were, for the most part, very pleasant people to know, but their social ideas were conventional, and Gaunt's unconventionalism irritated them much more than any kind of heresy would have done. But it soon became clear that the new note he had struck was very welcome in other quarters. There was in the congregation a considerable number of quietly obscure people, of whom Mrs. Holcomb was the type, people who fought hard battles in secret and needed sympathy. To them, Gaunt's latter teachings, being broadly human, spiritual, and touched with a tenderness of which they had never thought him capable, were as a brook by the way of thirsty lips. Margaret came to know these people little by little, and it filled her with a sense of shame and regret that she had not known them earlier. It was through contact with these people that Margaret arrived by another road at the conclusion Gaunt had already reached, viz., that the first aim of any true ministry should be to seek after those who knew most the hardness of human life, for they cannot recompense thee. The divine words were often in her thoughts. That strange reason for giving feasts which nevertheless seemed so simple and axiomatic to him who uttered it. He did not so much as offer the least explanation of it. There was Mrs. Holcomb, for example, with her tall, fine figure and white hair and patient eyes. What a life hers had been! Margaret drew the story from her one afternoon, when the falling shadows invited confidence, that hour which women choose for the exposition of those secret thoughts which shun the garish day. It was an old and common story. A husband weak rather than bad, who had consumed her property, ruined her life, and at last, after an act of fraud, had disappeared. Mrs. Holcomb told the story without a single word of blame or anger. After the crash came, she found she had just enough left to live on, with grinding economy, and the house where all her married life had been passed, and so she stayed there, with no company but her memories. There was another reason, too, which Margaret found infinitely pathetic. The forsaken wife still cherished a faint hope that her husband would reappear, and therefore she remained in New York, that he might know where to find her. There was not a day when her eyes did not search for his face among the restless passing throngs in New York. No wonder her eyes had grown dim with long patience, for she had searched 20 years in vain. She had even gone to the hospital wards in the poorhouse on Blackwell's Island from time to time, on the same hopeless quest, and to many other refuges of broken men where she imagined he might be found. He had wrought her great wrong. She expected nothing from him, yet there was not a night when she locked her door without a painful thought that she might be locking him out in the dark streets. Not a morning when she would not have welcomed him had he come to that door. The veriest beggar clothed in rags. And what could Margaret do but draw the forsaken woman to her bosom in a long caress? How different a caress from those shallow, quickly forgotten conventional caresses which she had bestowed on so many a careless friend who had now forgotten her. So Margaret also came to touch the realities of life, to understand the tragedy and heroism of obscure lives, and her nature was both sweetened and deepened by the knowledge. And there were other people, too, who she came to know and love, drawn to them by the new need for sympathy which existed in her own life. There was a little crippled woman, nearly blind, earning a precarious living by her needle, who had lately found her way into the church, attracted by the new note of sympathy in Gaunt's preaching. She usually chose a dim corner of the church where she could be unobserved and no one noticed her. But one day she hobbled down the aisle to Margaret's pew and pressed into her hand a little parcel containing a specimen of exquisite needlework for her use. And no gift Margaret had ever received touched her so deeply as this offering. And she was more touched still when the little old lady began to speak in gratitude of all the help she had received from Gaunt's ministry, for that was a kind of language to which Margaret had long been unaccustomed. And there were 2 humble men named Plain and Scarlet, who gave her a letter signed with their joint names, in which they assured her that they prayed for her and her husband every day, and bade her to be of good heart, for all would come out right some day, with much more to the same effect expressed in rude everyday phrases, which were the best they knew, and much more moving in their unaffected sincerity than more polite and scholarly phrases would have been. So one day Margaret made a little supper for Plain and Scarlet at her house, and invited the little old crippled lady whose name was Smith, and Mrs. Holcomb helped to entertain them. And she found their simplicity and goodness of heart so charming that she felt quite reconciled to the fact that Mrs. Somerset had struck her off her visiting list, and Mrs. Tasker had found her delicacy of constitution so great that for 3 months she had not been able to take the journey to the manse. So you see, there are compensations in every lot, and Margaret's great compensation at this time was the discovery of all kinds of beautiful things in human nature, as represented by humble folk, which made her gradually forget the discoveries she had made of all sorts of mean and ugly things in people by no means humble, whose code of manners and morals did not include kindness or charity nor constancy in the hour of need. And about these discoveries there was no need for dissimulation. She spoke of them joyously to her husband, and his face grew glad as she spoke. He recognized in them an arguity that the path he was taking was the right path. Perhaps it may sound a little paradoxical, yet I doubt whether John and Margaret Gaunt were ever quite so happy as in these difficult days, when they tasted for the first time the blessing of the poor, and daily leaned on each other with a sweeter confidence, and found that through the very breaking up of shallow friendships there was revealed to them the deeper treasure of unselfish love. No one minds being forsaken by the unworthy if the worthy remains with him. Both husband and wife prove now the truth of Palmer's aphorism, that the defection of the unworthy is the occasion of the worthy. And that's the end of Chapter 10, Part B. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 11, Renunciation. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.